from Florida. We'll now go to Ms. Barbara Lee from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much. It's been a very enlightening and important hearing. I'm glad to be back. I was on this committee for 11 years, and I was here during the debate around the authorization, the 2001 authorization. However, that never came to this committee. It 3 days after the horrific events of 9/11 and went straight to the floor. So this committee never had a chance to weigh in on that. The resolution, as was mentioned earlier and read, it was 60 words. It was overly broad, and it did set the stage and the framework for perpetual war. Only, I think now it's about 20% of members who are here today were here during that period. And so I have been consistently trying to repeal that authorization, and I want to clarify what several have said earlier, including Chairman Royce. The amendment I offered, I've been offering it for many years, but this year in Appropriations Committee, I serve on the PROPS now, which was adopted, was an amendment that would repeal the 2001 resolution, but it would give Congress 8 months, mind you, 8 months to come up with a new one prior to its repeal. Somehow it's being misunderstood and misconstrued that I'm saying, let's repeal it and then, you know, take as long as we want. So that's not the case, and I want to make sure everyone knows that, because that would be irresponsible, and I would not offer such an amendment. So we would have 8 months after the repeal to come up with a new one, and the repeal would stay in effect until we came up with a new one. I wanted to ask, just with regard to our national security strategy. Mr. Olson, you mentioned the toolbox in which we have in our counterterrorism efforts, and that every non-military strategy should possibly be used before the use of force. So I'd like to ask all of you, how do you view preventing conflicts in the first place? And what do you think about a 30% cut to the State Department and USAID funds in terms of our strategies to prevent the use of force and wars, the necessity for the use of force? And then secondly, on what basis should we authorize the use of force? I mean, generally, you mentioned terrorism is going to be with us. You know, we can't continue to use force everywhere in the world. How do we really refine and know which groups, which nations, which organizations are real threats to our national security? Or do we continue to, in many ways, get embroiled in civil wars that will just provide the United States the, well, we would be assured that we would be in these civil wars in perpetuity? So, Mr. Olson, could you start?
Sure, I'll start, and I will say that I agree with the point that you raise about the importance of a whole-of-government approach to our counterterrorism efforts. I think that's something that everyone I served with over 2 administrations, Republican and Democrat, agreed with, that was the necessary approach. In fact, the comments more recently of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis agrees with that as well, calling the use of military force a last resort in our counterterrorism fight. So there's broad agreement on that point. There's broad agreement on that all the different tools that are available, from law enforcement to economic to diplomatic. And I think a number of the comments that have been made today during this hearing about the fact that this is at some level, a struggle for ideas, and that countering the ideology that fuels terrorism is part of our efforts, and a lot of that is done out of the State Department. And so that's a critical component of our overall counterterrorism strategy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Congresswoman. I mean, I think I love General Mattis, now Secretary Mattis's quote he's famous for: if you're going to cut the State Department's budget, I need a bigger budget for bullets. And the idea being that's just going to generate more conflict without diplomacy. I agree that all the elements of national power ought to be brought to bear, and the military ought to be a last resort. And I don't think you'll find anyone in the military who likes war. I mean, it's just the horrific results of war and the toll on family and on our service members and civilians. We'd like to avoid war whenever possible, and so I agree with you 100%. We need diplomacy to work. We need other elements of national power to come into play first. And I think, as Mr. Olson's pointed out, you know, we often look for the military as that one solution, and therefore and it's important, it's an important solution, but it's not the solution to every problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I would just conclude by just saying, as we talk about and debate a new authorization, we have to remember this in terms of preventing the use of force as we discuss a new, if we ever do, authorization to use force. Because clearly, and I did vote against it because for me, I was the only one who voted against it. It was just too broad, and I knew it would set the stage for where we are now. So I thank you for this hearing, and I would hope that as we debate this, that what we just talked about is part of that debate, so the members of Congress can understand that our actions do lead to reactions that could continue these spiral of events where we may be able to pull back at some point and try to prevent further acts of terrorism if we do it differently. Thank you again.
I thank Ms. Lee, and I thank your hard work for trying to bring the AUMF to an end. And I've been on several of your bills, and I think we need to keep fighting that, and we will get this clarified. So thank you for your comments and your time.